This wasn't a fine. It wasn't a warning. It was a certified letter informing me that my homeowners association had officially started the process of taking my house and putting it up for auction to the highest bidder, all because of a dispute over the shade of beige on my shutters. I felt the blood drain from my face. My home, my family's safe haven, was suddenly on the line. I had 30 days to comply or lose everything. But what the HOA board didn't know was that I had just found something in their own bylaws, something they had forgotten about for decades, and it was about to turn their entire world upside down. It all started with a blade of grass, a single, solitary blade of grass, or at least that's what they claimed. We had moved into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Meadows precisely for its pristine appearance and sense of order. It seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. The lawns were emerald green and perfectly manicured, the houses were painted in harmonious, neutral tones, and everything felt peaceful. We signed the HOA covenants along with the mountain of other closing documents, viewing them as a formality, a promise to keep the neighborhood looking nice. For the first 2 years it was. We paid our dues on time, kept our grass trimmed, and lived our lives. The HOA board was a distant entity, a group of volunteers we'd see occasionally at the annual pool party. The president was a woman named Barbara. She always seemed pleasant enough, with a perfectly styled bob, and a knack for organizing the holiday decoration contest. Then came the rain, a week of torrential biblical downpours that made mowing the lawn impossible. The moment the sun broke through, I called my landscaper, but he was backed up for days. The grass grew, and it was in that narrow window on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:17 p.m. that the HOA's compliance officer paid a visit. The violation notice arrived 2 days later. It was crisp, official, and cold. Long grass exceeding regulated height of 8 inches, measured at 9.75 inches. Fine, $200. I laughed. It had to be a mistake. I called the management company, assuming a simple phone call would clear it up. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The measurement was verified. The fine stands. A flicker of annoyance sparked in my chest, but it was just $200. I thought about just paying it to avoid the hassle. But a principal was nagging at me. This was absurd. It was grass. It had been raining. Didn't common sense factor in anywhere? I decided I wouldn't just pay it. I would go to a hearing and explain. Surely they would see reason. I couldn't have been more wrong. The initial shock of the fine was quickly replaced by a simmering, righteous anger. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was a declaration of war over a blade of grass. My first move was what any reasonable person would do. I scheduled a hearing with the HOA board, convinced that once I stood before them, a human being, and not just a house number, this absurdity would be cleared up. The meeting was held in a sterile community center room that smelled of cheap coffee and floor wax. The board sat behind a long table, a panel of 5 judges presiding over my domestic affairs. There was Barbara, the president, a woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes and whose perfectly coordinated beige outfit seemed to be a uniform. Next to her was Mark, the treasurer, who barely looked up from his spreadsheet. I laid out my case calmly, showing them dated photographs of my lawn, the receipt from the landscaper, and even a signed letter from my neighbor affirming the mowing schedule. Barbara listened with a placid, practiced patience. When I finished, she steepled her fingers. "We appreciate you coming in," she said, her voice syrupy with faux sympathy. "But the covenant is very clear. The visual standard of the community must be maintained. The grass was measured at 9 3/4 inches by our compliance officer at 3:17 p.m. on Tuesday. The rule states 8 inches is the maximum. There's no ambiguity here." I felt the ground shift beneath me. This wasn't about reason. It was about control. So 1/4 of an inch during a week of historic rainfall is worth a $200 fine? I asked, my voice tightening. "The fine isn't for the length of the grass," Mark said, finally looking up, his glasses reflecting the cold fluorescent lights. "It's for noncompliance. The amount is designed to encourage timely adherence." The meeting ended with them upholding the fine. "Consider it a lesson in community standards," Barbara said as I walked out, the dismissal feeling like a physical slap. I paid the fine. I thought that would be the end of it. I was naively, foolishly wrong. It was as if paying the fine had given them a taste of blood. The violations began to arrive with a terrifying regularity, each one more petty and bizarre than the last. A week later, a new notice arrived. Violation: non-approved garden gnome present in front flower bed. The gnome was a gift from my daughter. It was 4 inches tall. I appealed. They denied it. The fine was $50. Then it was the mailbox, a tiny, almost invisible speck of rust on the hinge, dilapidated exterior fixture. $150. My wife left her bicycle on the side of the house for a single afternoon, visible from the sidewalk. Violation: unsightly equipment stored in public view. $75. Each envelope in the mailbox became a little bomb of anxiety. My home, my sanctuary, had been transformed into a panopticon. I started seeing the compliance officer's car, a bland silver sedan, idling at the end of my street. I began to feel watched, scrutinized, and judged in my own yard. The simple joy of gardening was replaced by a paranoid need to measure, to document, to preemptively justify my every action. My frustration curdled into a cold, hard knot of determination. I wasn't just going to pay these anymore. I requested formally a copy of the entire HOA covenant, bylaws, and all meeting minutes from the past year. The packet that arrived was hundreds of pages thick, a labyrinth of legalese and arbitrary rules. And that's when I found Rule 7.4-C. It was buried on page 87, a subsection under architectural control. It stated that any permanent external structure required pre-approval from the architectural committee. That made sense for sheds or decks, but the definition of permanent structure was terrifyingly vague. And then I saw the kicker. This includes, but is not limited to, children's play sets, swing sets, and tree houses. My blood ran cold. My daughter's birthday was in 2 weeks. Her one big gift, the thing she'd been talking about for months, was sitting in a giant box in my garage. A beautiful, professionally made cedar treehouse kit. I'd spent weeks assembling it in secret. I immediately filled out the 20-page architectural request form, submitted diagrams, photos of the product, and even a signed letter from my immediate neighbors stating they had no objections. I dropped the packet off at the management company's office, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The response came not by mail, but by email. It was from Barbara herself. Request denied. The reason cited was potential for decreased property values and aesthetic nonconformity with community character. I was stunned. I called her. Barbara, it's a treehouse for a child. It's made of cedar, for God's sake. It's more attractive than my actual house. Her tone was icy. The board's decision is final. Erecting the structure will result in a $50 daily fine until it is removed. I stood in my garage looking at that big box, imagining the heartbreak on my daughter's face. This was no longer about grass or gnomes. They were coming from my family's joy. They were trying to dictate the memories I could create with my own child on my own property. That was the breaking point. The polite homeowner was gone. Now it was something else. I went back to the bylaws, my fingers smudging the ink as I scoured every word, every clause, looking for anything, a loophole, a contradiction, a forgotten rule. And then buried in a section about member voting rights, I found it. Article 12, Section 3. It was old, written in slightly different legal language than the rest of the document. It was a clause about emergency member votes. It stated that if a board decision was deemed capricious or unduly punitive by just 10% of the neighborhood's homeowners, a special vote could be called to overturn it. My mind raced. This was it. This was my tool. But was it still valid? Had it been superseded by something else? I had to know. I drove to the county clerk's office, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I needed to see the original filed copy of the HOA covenants. The version they had given me could have been edited. The version on file with the county, that was the law of the land. The clerk brought me a massive leather-bound tome. I found the page and my heart stopped. There it was. Article 12, Section 3, clear as day. And right next to it, in the margin of the original document, was a handwritten note I almost missed. A note that changed everything. It was a single sentence, signed by the original community developer decades ago, that gave this obscure clause unimaginable teeth. This was no longer about fighting a fine. This was about exposing a lie that went to the very top. The battle had just begun, and I was holding their secret weapon in my hands. The annual HOA meeting was held under the fluorescent glare of the community center. the same room where this nightmare had begun. The air was thick with the low murmur of homeowners, a mixture of curiosity and quiet resentment. I sat in the back, a folder of documents resting on my lap like a live explosive. My heart was a drum against my ribs. Barbara took the podium, her smile as polished and insincere as ever. She ran through the minutes, the budget report, and the new initiatives for community beautification. It was all a performance, a display of her unchallenged authority. Then she opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up, mostly about garbage collection and pool hours. I waited. I let the mundane questions cycle through. And then, when there was a lull, I stood up. "Barbara," I said, my voice cutting through the stuffy air. The room went quiet. Everyone knew my story, the grass, the gnome, the treehouse. I was the neighborhood cautionary tale. "Yes," she said, her tone dripping with condescending patience. "Another question about your fines? We've been over this. The rules are the rules." "This isn't about the fines," I said, walking slowly toward the front. "This is about the rules themselves, specifically Article 12, Section 3 of our original covenants filed with the county on May 14, 1978. A faint ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Barbara's smile tightened. "Our current bylaws supersede those. We've amended them over the years." "Have you?" I asked, stopping before the podium. I opened my folder. "Because I have the original filed right here, and I also have the amended version you provided to all of us. There's a fascinating discrepancy." I held up the county's document, a photocopy with an official seal. Article 12, Section 3 grants homeowners a powerful right. It states that if 10% of members sign a petition deeming a board decision capricious or unduly punitive, a special vote must be called to overturn it. Barbara waved a dismissive hand. "A relic. That clause was rendered obsolete by the amendment voted on in 2015. "That's what your version says," I agreed, my voice growing louder. I held up the version the HOA had given me. On it, Article 12, Section 3 was simply crossed out with a single line and the word void written in the margin. But that's not what the county has. You see, an amendment to the covenants requires a 2/3 majority vote of all homeowners. And according to the county records, I paused, letting the silence stretch, every eye in the room glued to me. No such vote ever took place in 2015. The gasp in the room was audible. Barbara's face lost its smugness, paling by several shades. Mark, the treasurer, began frantically shuffling papers. You're mistaken," Barbara stammered, her composure cracking. "I'm not," I said, my voice cold and clear. "The only thing filed in 2015 was a change to the pool hours. Someone," I said, looking directly at her, "took it upon themselves to edit the rulebook unilaterally. They illegally voided a homeowner protection to consolidate their own power." I turned to face my neighbors, my community. But that's not even the best part. I pointed to the margin of the county's original document, to the handwritten note I had discovered. The original developer, Mr. Evans, must have foreseen a board like this. He added a note right here. It states that any board member found to have knowingly enforced a voided or illegally amended rule is subject to immediate recall and is personally liable for all legal fees and fines incurred by the homeowner under that false rule. The room erupted. People were on their feet shouting questions. Barbara was frozen at the podium, her mouth agape, utterly exposed. The facade of order and control had shattered into a million pieces. She wasn't a president enforcing rules. She was a fraud who had been caught manufacturing them. I leaned into the microphone one last time, the words hanging in the electric air. "So, Barbara, by your own logic, rules are rules. The question isn't about my treehouse anymore. The question is, how do you plan on paying me back?" The silence that followed my question was more deafening than the shouts that had preceded it. All eyes were on Barbara, who stood at the podium looking like a statue of her former self, pale, rigid, and utterly hollowed out. The gavel she used to wield with such authority now seemed like a ridiculous prop next to her trembling hand. The myth of her invincibility had evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. She had no answer. There was no clever legal maneuver, no snippy retort. There was only the crushing weight of public exposure. She simply gathered her papers, avoiding the furious and betrayed stares of her neighbors, and walked out of the room without another word. The meeting dissolved into chaos. but it was a chaos of empowerment, not confusion. Homeowners surrounded me, not with anger, but with questions, their own folders of grievances suddenly feeling validated. The aftermath was swift, methodical, and deeply satisfying. The very next day, I formally delivered a package to the HOA's management company and every member of the board. It contained copies of the county-filed covenants, a notarized letter from the county clerk confirming no amendment vote had occurred on Article 12, Section 3, and an itemized invoice. I listed every single fine I had been forced to pay, plus statutory interest, and a demand for immediate reimbursement under the developer's clause. At the bottom, in bold, I noted that failure to comply within 30 days would result in a small claims lawsuit naming each board member personally liable. I received a certified check for the full amount within the week. There was no letter, no apology, just the silent, stark admission of guilt. But the financial victory was just the beginning. The real change happened in the neighborhood. A special meeting was called, not by the board, but by homeowners using the very clause they had tried to erase. With over 10% of the community signing the petition, we had the authority. In a historic vote, Barbara and the entire board were officially recalled and removed from their positions. The election that followed wasn't a contest of personalities, but a referendum on transparency. A new board was elected, made up of pragmatic, fair-minded homeowners who had been quietly horrified by the tyranny for years. Their first official act was to formally reinstate Article 12, Section 3, cementing that crucial homeowner check on power. Their second was a systematic review of every fine issued over the previous 2 years. Dozens of homeowners received refunds for petty, unjust violations. The compliance officer's silver sedan was never seen idling on our street again. The culture of the neighborhood shifted. The constant, low-grade anxiety that came with checking the mail evaporated. People started painting their front doors brighter colors. Someone actually put up a pink flamingo just because they could. The sense of community didn't weaken. It strengthened because it was now based on mutual respect, not fear. As for me, the victory was personal. The weekend after the check cleared, I built the treehouse. My daughter, her laughter ringing through the backyard, helped me hammer the final nail. It stands there now, a beautiful cedar structure that is so much more than a playhouse. It's a monument to the idea that you cannot bully people into conformity. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do for your family is to fight for the right to be a little different, to have a little joy on your own property. The story spread, of course. I heard from people in other subdivisions, in other states, who were facing their own versions of Barbara. They asked for advice, for copies of the documents, for hope. I became a reluctant guide, pointing them toward the county records office, advising them to read every word of their covenants. The most powerful weapon against a bully, I learned, is often not a louder voice, but an older document. This wasn't just about a treehouse or a fine. It was about a fundamental principle. A home is not just an asset to be managed by a committee. It is a castle, a sanctuary, the embodiment of a family's dreams and hard work. And no one, no matter how much authority they think they hold, has the right to threaten that over a quarter inch of grass. So I'll leave you with this question. How many of us are living in communities where the rule book has been quietly edited? How many of us are following rules that were never truly voted on, never truly legal, designed not to protect property values, but to feed the egos of a few power-hungry individuals? The greatest power an HOA has is the assumption of its own authority. But that authority is granted by the homeowners, and it can be taken away. My story is proof that you don't have to surrender. You just have to be willing to look in the places they forgot about, to find the truth they tried to erase, and to stand up in a quiet room and speak it loudly for everyone to hear. The foundation of their power is often just as fragile as a single sheet of paper. All you have to do is find it.